Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. In today's episode, we'll follow one of Germany's lesser-known so-called Blitzkrieg victories, the campaign in the Balkans in 1941. A victory that has given rise to heated debates about its impact on the future course of the war. Hi, Jesse. As I always say, my catchphrase now, I think, here we are again, another week, another podcast. So we're continuing the story of the Balkans campaign. In the previous episode, we talked about the definition of the Balkans. We talked about how war is brought to the Balkans in the first place. So in 1940 with the Italian invasion. But of course, we now need to bring everything forward. And we're now getting to the stage where, as I said in the opening sentence, Germany, Hitler and the Wehrmacht get involved in this part of the world as well, which of course is changing the dynamics there in 1941. How much summing up do we need to do from the last episode? Do we need to revisit something to set the scene for this one? What do you think?
We always do. I don't want to bring.
That's very true.
I don't want to bring you, listeners and viewers, the main course without at least, a little bit of an appetizer or a little bit of a soup or something along those lines. Anyway, I digress. The point is this. We're starting our story for today's episode basically in spring 1941, March, April. That time of the year, spring in the Balkans, normally a lovely time. 1941, not so much. Let's put it that way. What has happened is that in October 1940, Italy decides to invade Greece. They don't tell Germany about that. It's not a coordinated action, and it doesn't go well. So the Greeks actually end up pushing the Italians back a little bit, and the Italian campaign is in trouble. In fact, Italy is in trouble generally. They've had some other defeats in North Africa, East Africa, in the Mediterranean. And so the Germans now look and say, well, how are we going to solve this problem? Our strategic interests are in play as well, because now the Brits are supporting the Greeks more actively. They're landing some troops on some Greek islands, and potentially that could pose a danger to, for example, German oil supplies in Romania. And Germany at this stage has already decided to invade the Soviet Union. So they're going to have to resolve any issues in the Balkans and threats to oil or threats to Italian stability from defeats at the hands of the British before they can go ahead and start the main show from the German point of view against the Soviet Union. So in late 1940, Germany already decides we're going to intervene in the Balkans. Now, this isn't just a military question, of course, it's a political question. So Germany has been active on the political front, trying to get other countries in the region and in Central Europe to join its side so that everything is nice and under control when they invade the Soviet Union. So you have countries like Yugoslavia, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania. They are trying to be convinced, a little bit coerced into signing various treaties and various sort of degrees of alliances with the Germans, which they generally do. So you'd think that everything would be fine. Greece is the only thorn in the Axis side now, and the Germans will be able to take out Greece and save Italy and save their southern flank. But Yugoslavia throws a spoke in the wheels of the Axis in March 1941. But before we dive into that, Matthias, perhaps you'd like to bring a few ingredients to our recipe here before we dig into the main course. I'm hungry. Can anybody tell? Can anyone tell I'm hungry right now? I don't know.
Well, as always, you've set the scene absolutely right. We prepared the menu and then set the table. There we go, to stick with this analogy. The interesting thing is really, as you said, well, the Germans are already looking towards these, but they do understand that they need to have some sort of flank protection. They need to keep the entire Balkans area quiet, you might say. They achieved that with some countries by signing more treaties. For example, I think it's on the 20th of November 1940, if I'm not mistaken, Hungary signs a treaty and joins the Tripartite Pact. So this is this idea of all against the Soviet Union, and basically it's under German leadership. It's not supposed to be, but it is basically German leadership. And they're hoping that the rest of this entire area will follow. So Bulgaria in particular, Romania is extremely important because of the oil fields. We've mentioned this a number of times in separate episodes of the podcast. So the oil fields are really important to the Germans. You've got Greece. We already mentioned this. This is the problem. Maybe it can be contained. That is okay, as long as you've got Italy fighting against Greece. That is fine. You now have the problem that Britain is beginning to get more and more engaged. Again, in the last episode, we talked about this in quite some detail. So this is not looking all that good. And then, as you already said, the next problem, of course, is Yugoslavia. So Yugoslavia is a big country in that part of the world. Of course, it's a young country. It was created after the end of the First World War. Within that, you have all sorts of tensions between these different nationalities, the different groups, in particular between the Croats and the Serbs, but that's not all of them. Just fast forward to the 1990s, the collapse of Yugoslavia, and basically you get the idea. So there are very interesting issues and problems and tensions in that particular country. Having said that, at this stage, it is a monarchy. So you have the king at the top, and you have these two major factions between the Croats and the Serbs. I'm keeping it a bit simple and simplistic, because otherwise we'd be here forever trying to understand the ins and outs of Yugoslavian politics at that particular time, which is really, really quite difficult to understand. And so Hitler and Mussolini, well, again, they just simply look at the map and say, wouldn't it be a great idea if we could bring Yugoslavia into our sphere of influence as well? Just, for example, think about Mussolini, think about Albania that we talked about in quite some detail in the last episode. So if you get Yugoslavia, and you can actually have a very nice land bridge between mainland Italy and Albania, so that would really work. For the Germans, it would be good, because that means that you can have peace and quiet on the eastern flank, not on the western front, but on the eastern flank. And so that looks good. So they basically coerce, you might say, the Yugoslavian king to sign a treaty to join this tripartite pact with the Germans and these other nations. So they would basically bring Yugoslavia into the camp of the fascist state. And that's on the 25th of March 1939. Hitler, using the usual coercive methods. So he invites the king a number of times, and the government, and a little bit it's similar to what you had seen previously, for example, with Austria in 1938. So there's a lot of pressure put on Yugoslavia as well. In the end, to cut a relatively long story short, the king then, he says, and the government at that particular time in Yugoslavia, they decided, yes, they're going to sign this particular pact, and they're going to move into the camp of the fascist / the Nazi states in Europe. That now sets in motion really very, very quickly a counter movement in Yugoslavia. And again, we need to drill in a little bit deeper and understand the factions there. You now have an let's call it anti-West is the wrong word, but anti-Italian, anti-German movement, and one that is leading more towards the east, to Russia, to a smaller degree also to the Western allies, in particular Britain. And it's a group which is mainly consists of Serbs. So again, you can see these different factions that play a role in this country. Again, you'd have to really drill into this and spend now 15 hours just talking about the composition of these different groups to really do it justice. But maybe a very, very broad brush here is enough to understand what happens. And as a consequence of that, you have a coup. And on the 27th of March, there is a coup. The government is overthrown. The king goes into exile. They find the 17-year-old heir to the throne. They declare that he's now old enough to become king. He doesn't know anything about this. If I remember correctly, he's told about the standing at a train station that he's now the king. And they say, no, even you're only 17, you're not old enough, well, go and jump on the throne and you're now the king. Of course, the idea being that he would be a little bit, you might say, of a puppet, and the group of Serbian, mainly officers, but also politicians, would hold all the reins in their hands. And of course, this again completely changes now the political dynamic, because not only have you now lost this new ally down there on the southeastern flank, as Germany and also Italy, but of course this coup d'etat, well, it also looks particularly bad. So this is basically, well, the Germans and the Italians will see that as, what's the right word? An insult, maybe, and it's sending out completely the wrong message to the rest of the world. So from the German and Italian perspective, well, these guys now need to be taught a lesson. They need to be taught a lesson because of political reasons, but also for military reasons. Again, linking all this to Greece and all these things that we talked about in this episode and the previous episode. Of course, you also then have, again, the wider question of the Balkans, and there these constantly shifting borders. Well, you had these borders shifted after the First World War. You had shifting borders before the First World War, the two Balkan wars, which brings a number of other countries. So Hungary is now getting interested. Bulgaria is looking at the map and thinking, wouldn't be a great idea if we could get a piece of that cake as well. So that's Yugoslavia and Greece. So you can see, again, it's all very complex, very confusing, but with a very broad brush. Now the Germans are looking at this and think, well, we need to get involved. We need to sort out that mess that's happening down there, and we need to do it once and for all. And this is now leading to the next step of this whole history of the Second World War in the Balkans.
Yeah, I mean, when a system of international order breaks down, it's not good for keeping the peace, right? And neighbors start to dredge up old claims because, yes, there have been shifting borders in the Balkans. You're absolutely right about that. And they shifted quite a lot in the recent history, if we're looking at it from 1941, so just 20 plus years before. There's a complete redrawing of the map in the 19th century as the Ottoman Empire weakened. Borders were redrawn there. But that also happened in Eastern Europe. In earlier times, Western Europe had shifting borders. It's just it's a very difficult moment when an international order breaks. And that's what's happening, of course, at the start of World War II in this part of the world. Now, let's say from a human point of view, the tragedy, one of the many tragic aspects of it, is that Greece actually secretly so the Greek dictator, Matthias, he dies in January 1941. But before he dies, he reaches out kind of through the backdoor channels to the Germans and says, can you kind of help us come to an agreement with Italy and stop the war? They don't want it to continue. But by then, Germany's already decided on solving the problem by military means alone. So there was a diplomatic opportunity there that Germany, in this case, rejected because they're like, well, we're going to solve the Greek question with military means. We're going to solve any uncertainties, let's say, with Yugoslavia by political means, and we will force them to join our coalition, as you pointed out. I think, by the way, I am no Yugoslavia expert, but I think that the monarch in charge before the coup was a regent. He was a Prince Paul, I think his name was. In any case, right, so he makes this, or he and his government make this decision to accept the German quote-unquote offer. But as you mentioned, there's quite a lot of arguing going on internally. Some of that has to do with, some Croatians would like to have independence from a mostly Serb-dominated Yugoslavia. But then you have communists who are not in love with the idea of joining a fascist pact. They would be even less in love with it once the war begins with the Soviet Union. But then you have liberals who are not in love with it. And then you have Serb nationalists even who are not in love with it. So you have a broad, almost consensus, at least amongst the Serbian political orientations, and some others, although I don't know as much about the others, that opposes this. And of course, the Serbs dominate the command of the army. And so that's how you end up with a coup, right? And that's how you end up with the government deciding that 17-year-old King Peter is now King Peter II, and voila, we're good to go. That was on the 27th. So you mentioned that the Germans and Italians felt insulted by this. No question. This is a prestige thing, which is very important in history. I think we lost sight of how important prestige can be in the last couple of decades and convinced ourselves that it wasn't as much of a factor. I suppose we're learning that lesson now in the 2020s. But of course, here's yet another historical example. So Hitler, when he decides, okay, we're gonna get back at Yugoslavia, we're gonna establish control of Yugoslavia, he issues a directive number 25. And there's a line in there that stuck out at me because I think it shows the mindset of no compromise, right? One of the lines translated into English is, Yugoslavia should be considered an enemy even if it soon makes a statement of loyalty. So even if the new Yugoslav government goes back and says, actually, Germany, we're okay with you or whatever, this doesn't matter at this point. And the sentence ends, even if it makes a statement of loyalty, it should be destroyed as soon as possible. So not only should it be taken over, should there be regime change, the state should be destroyed. So here we have a little echo maybe of the German way of thinking about Eastern European states as not having any legitimacy. So in Poland, they destroyed the state, said Poland doesn't exist. The Soviets agreed. In this case, they're kind of thinking along the same lines for Yugoslavia. There are a couple of other, let's say, strategic considerations as well. It's not just all an emotional fit, let's say. They need Yugoslavia as a base of operations if they're going to invade Greece. There are great access points. Great. None of the access points to Greece are great given the mountainous terrain, but there's the Monastir Gap. There's the Struma River Valley. So there are these areas in southern Yugoslavia that the Germans can use to jump off against Greece. They also want to be able to control the Danube River, which is an important artery for shipping raw materials in barges, coal, or whatever. And there are important copper mines in Yugoslavia as well that the Germans are interested in controlling. So they can't, from the German point of view, they just can't tolerate a Yugoslavia that says, nope, we're independent and we'll trade copper with you if we decide. And that's the end of the story. We're in control of our territory. Germany cannot tolerate such a thing. And that is the genesis of their decision to invade, which comes then in early April. I also have some thoughts about Hungary, but Matthias, I don't want to leave you on the edge of your seat for too long. Do you want to take us farther along in this build up to the invasion? Or should I share a little about Hungary? All right.
Go for Hungary. Mm-hmm.
So Hungary is waiting in the wings here as well, right? As you mentioned, they're looking at these borders. Hey, now's a chance to revise potentially the borders. There are many in Hungary who are unhappy with its borders, and that's an understatement because the pre-World War I Kingdom of Hungary was fairly large, and then post-World War I Kingdom of Hungary is like less than half the size. So, and there are sizable Hungarian ethnic minorities outside of Hungary based on that post-First World War treaty, the Treaty of Trianon. So, the dictator of Hungary, guy by the name of Horthy Miklós, or Miklós Horthy in the Western way of saying it, he's keen on taking advantage of the situation to recover some territory, but he also doesn't want to risk, heavy fighting. His prime minister, Teleki, isn't so keen on the idea. He thinks this could be a mistake, especially because Hungary and Yugoslavia signed a peace and friendship treaty in December 1940. So what are you doing now in April saying, oh yeah, it doesn't matter. Germans are going to do stuff, we're going to do it too. So you do have some Hungarian politicians who say, well, we can't do this. We have some kind of principles. And in the days just before the invasion, which begins on the 6th of April, the German invasion, it becomes obvious that Hungary is probably going to participate, and Teleki commits suicide. So, this is serious business. This is not just lines moving on a map. People are aware, the actors are aware of the significance of this and their moral responsibility. So, in the end, what Horthy says is, it's a bit tricky. He says, we'll respect our treaty with Yugoslavia unless Yugoslavia happens to stop existing. So they play to this idea that they know is coming, that, well, if ever Croatia were to declare independence, or if ever Germany were to decide that Yugoslavia doesn't exist, well, then we could invade them because our treaty is null and void. Kind of like the Soviet approach to Poland, right? That's how they tried to justify their invasion of Poland as well, saying, well, Germans invaded it, it doesn't exist anymore, right? That's very convenient fiction. So that is a little bit anyway, a little insight into the basics of the Hungarian approach to this. So that's why Hungary eventually joins the invasion, not on the first day though, but I'll save that little nugget for a few moments from now. So Matthias, that was my build-up story. Let's go for it.
Well, there's another country that we can throw into the mix again. We mentioned the country briefly, more or less in passing. That, of course, is Bulgaria.
Yeah, Bulgaria.
So Bulgaria is, of course, sits there as well. And you might say it's a little bit of a difficult geographical position because you've got Greece to the south, you've got Yugoslavia to the west. The army isn't really particularly strong. But again, if you want to understand Bulgarian politics, you need to go back to the First World War, the losses of territory, all these things that we now mentioned a number of times. So we keep coming back to this. And Bulgaria also tries to play a very clever political game. And in the end, they agree that, okay, we're not going to send any troops anyway into all of this fighting here because, well, that's not really for us. But we're letting German troops in. And the Germans are able to deploy troops into Bulgaria and then launch the attack into Yugoslavia and then Greece, also from Bulgaria. And that is important because when you look at the map of this particular part of the world, so we now have Yugoslavia, you might say, in our center of that map. And Yugoslavia is now surrounded either by the sea to the west, or by, with the exception of Greece to the southeast, a very, very relatively small part of the overall border, you're now surrounded by either enemies or, let's call them potential enemies, or at least people who are willing to work together with your enemies. So that is in the northwestern part, that is Italy. So you've got a straight border with Italy. Consequence again of the First World War. You can look at the Sonso battles of 1915 to 17. That's basically more or less the area that we're looking at. You then have Austria to the north, which of course at that stage is part of Greater Germany. So that's been united with Germany. So you've got Austrian and German troops there. To the northeast, you then have Hungary, and you already talked about Hungary and the situation of Hungary. And to the further to the east, you've got Romania, which plays also but a slightly lesser role in all of this. You also have a small buildup of particularly German troops there. But then mainly again, it's Bulgaria, and that also plays a very important role as a springboard. So you look at this from a Yugoslavian point of view. Strategically, it's not looking all that good. You do have a few potential issues. It's also interesting that the Greeks are looking at this and the Brits are looking at this as well. And finally, when this operation happens, and because you have this coup, there's actually their assessment is on both the Greek side and the British side that this was the wrong move. Yugoslavia should have stayed as it had been, if you need to even sign that treaty with the Germans, because that means Germany is not going to invade that part of the world. And that means if something else happens, particularly again with the Italians through Albania, you only have to fight on one front. What both the Greeks and the British are worried about is that by Bulgaria opening its border to Axis troops, in particular German troops, these troops will now be able to outmaneuver the Metaxa line, the Greek defensive line. We'll come back to that later. I just thought I'd throw this in because we're talking about Bulgaria. So what happens now? So you've got this build-up of forces. You've got the Yugoslavian army were basically dislocated across the entire country because they want to cover all of this and protect their entire country, which makes it really, really difficult, as we just heard, just looking at the political and military situation. So you've got one army coming in from the west. That's the Second Italian Army. And that's more or less, well, attacking again through this area of more or less the Sonso, where they'd already fought in the First World War, a bit further to the east. And basically they're seizing and going for Ljubljana, as the Germans would call it. So basically the capital of Slovenia, so the northwestern part of Yugoslavia. At the same time, you've got one of the main German thrusts coming in from Austria, and that is the German Second Army. And that, you might say, is pushing more or less straight south, first of all towards Zagreb, trying to seize the capital of, well, basically Croatia, if you want to look at it this way. At the same time, from Hungary, you've got a German force coming in. That's German Panzer Corps that is pushing in from the east. Later on, you already talked about this, you've got a Hungarian army coming in, pushing straight south towards the Danube. We already talked about the Hungarian contribution. Small contingent coming in from Romania. And you also have another mechanized group, that's the first Panzer Group, coming in from Bulgaria, basically pushing towards the northwest. So the idea is that you have all these different pincers. First of all, the ones coming in the north and the northwest, they would all more or less meet in the Zagreb area. That's the first step of this operation. And from there, then roll up the Yugoslavian positions and basically move to the southeast, where at some stage these troops would then link up and meet up with this Panzer Group, which is coming in from the southeast Bulgaria, which is going towards Belgrade first, so the capital, and then pushing further to the northwest towards further in the area of the Danube. That is the general operational plan that is put together basically under German leadership. The whole operation starts with aerial bombardments. The famous one, or the infamous one, is the bombing of Belgrade, which causes heavy civilian casualties as well. Also from a military point of view, it is quite important because it manages to cut a number of these links and lines, also communication lines to the other units and formations of the Yugoslavian army, which makes it more difficult for them to coordinate the whole fight. You also then have this very rapid advance of all these pincers coming in from all the sides. Perhaps the most famous one is the one that's coming in from the southeast. So not the strongest one, but probably the famous one, so from the first Panzer Group. And why is that the most famous one? Because that leads to the fall of Belgrade. So on the 6th of April, the attack is launched. There's a bombing of Belgrade, as I said. And you now have a very interesting episode that leads to the fall of the capital of Yugoslavia. And it just might be worth telling this particular story. And it's all linked to an SS junior officer, and he's called Fritz Klingenberg. And he's part of a recce unit, reconnaissance unit of an SS division. And so he is part of, I think it's Das Reich, if I'm not mistaken. So he's the spearhead of this division and this pincer going towards Belgrade. And on the 11th of April, he reaches the outskirts of Belgrade. He crosses the river. His little boat is a bit shot up by the Yugoslavian defenders. So in the end, he reaches the other bank of the river with 6 men. So what you do now? You could probably just surrender. That would probably be the sensible thing to do, or try to get away. But he says, no, that's not what we're doing. And he basically marches into Belgrade, marches right bang into the center, demands to see the authorities, and tells them that he is the forward detachment. And if these guys don't surrender immediately, within whatever it is, half an hour, 45 minutes, you would have another air attack and you would get shelled by German artillery, which is already ready to fire into Belgrade. He's just there to negotiate the surrender. Please surrender now and spare the city this particular fate. After the bombing, everyone is already kind of a bit on edge anyway, and the authorities of Belgrade agree to this. So with 6 men, this particular chap managed to seize the capital of Yugoslavia, which in itself is quite an impressive achievement. He's awarded the Knight's Cross for this. He then continues the war, and is then killed. I think it's on the 23rd of March, if I'm not mistaken, 1945, fighting against the Americans. So he doesn't survive the war. But it's a very famous story. It's a story that's still being told today. Sometimes when you want to see the achievement or the possibilities and opportunities that boldness and perhaps you might call it careless action can sometimes have and can sometimes achieve. And that perhaps is enough for the operational picture that we have. Say, Yugoslavia is being squeezed from all sides, and that makes it really difficult, particularly if you try to defend more or less everything. I mean, the only bit where they not have to fight is to the southeast, because that's where they've got the border with Greece. Apart from that, you can see right from the beginning, just looking at the map and the operational picture, this is a very, very tricky situation for the Yugoslavian army or the Yugoslavian armed forces. And it's pretty obvious that they're not going to win in the long run. I mean, the campaign is a very, very quick one. It only really takes about a week and 5 days, from the 6th to the 18th of April. So that is really quick. Then the army disintegrates and falls apart, and the army surrenders and the state surrenders. It's not the end of fighting in this part of the world, by the way, because you then move into the different factions, fight against each other. And you go into this very brutal partisan warfare as well. That is probably for another podcast. But the conventional fighting, the conventional battle between, let's call them the Axis powers, because it's more than just the Germans here, and the Yugoslavian army is over relatively quickly. So 6th to the 18th of April. Also, you look at the numbers. Well, actually, the numbers are interesting because the Yugoslavian army is not that weak. So they mobilized somewhere in the region of 700,000 men, roughly speaking. 400,000 of these are not really proper military personnel. They are the militia. They are reservists being called up, not properly equipped. On paper, they look really good. In reality, probably far less than that. Where they have the problem is the equipment is modern air force, for example. It's tanks, these things. They're not very good at this. But just looking at the numbers, it's not looking all that bad, particularly when you compare that to the other side. You're looking at, roughly speaking, 300,000 Italians, and you're looking at, roughly speaking, 340,000 Germans, who, of course, are now experienced. They've fought a number of campaigns. They've got the equipment, so they've got about just under 900 tanks, and they managed to fight their way through. And the interesting thing is also, and after this I shut up because I know I've been talking for quite some time here, is when you look at the numbers and the casualty figures here, they're really interesting, because the numbers of killed, particularly, again, call them the Axis camp, are quite low. So on the German side, it's 151 killed. So that is really a very low number. Italy is around 800, and Hungary is about 120, plus wounded, plus missing. But this is a very, very, very small number. And then you look at the other side, what's happening in Yugoslavia. The main bit here really is the number of captured soldiers. And you're looking at, again, the numbers vary, somewhere in the region between 250 and 350,000 Yugoslavian soldiers are captured by the Axis powers, which in itself seems to suggest that the army disintegrates quite quickly. So it doesn't really stand and fight in most places, but it falls apart because they're not trained properly. You've got this large part, as I said, militia. They're not equipped properly, which also explains why the campaign only takes this very, very short period of time. It also explains why you then go into the next phase, which is the partisan warfare. So the Italians capture an additional 30,000 to the number I just mentioned. A few aircrew are killed, not that many. A number of ships are captured, but that basically gives you an idea. So very, very low casualties on the Axis side, particularly the German side. The killed and wounded on the Yugoslavian side, particularly in the military, quite low as well. You have civilian casualties, for example, the bombing of Belgrade and other cities. The main event here, you might say, the main figure is the number of captured military personnel, which, again, I'm repeating myself, tells you that the army disintegrates quite quickly. And that's enough for me, because I've now talked for quite a while. There we are.
Yeah, I mean, the Yugoslavs are in a very difficult position. As you mentioned, on paper, they have a lot of men that they can call up. But in practice, in terms of how many of those men can even fight at all or in any way equipped to fight, they're outnumbered more than 2-1 by their enemy. The Axis have almost 10 times as many tanks, about 10 times as many aircraft, not to mention the quality aspect. So, I mean, it's extremely difficult. Then you have, the shock factor, the shock and awe factor, when you have bombings like in Belgrade. In 90 minutes, the German bombings kill 4,000 people. And by 1945 standards, that's like a Tuesday afternoon raid somewhere. But by 1941 standards, no one has conceived of this. No one is ready for this psychologically, or shelters or anti-aircraft defenses. It's not even close. In fact, the initial bombs that fall target some of the anti-aircraft positions, and then they're completely out of it. So the city is completely defenseless. In addition, mobilization didn't go particularly well for the Yugoslavs either. So they didn't want to provoke the Germans. You can see another pattern here in history, maybe similar to the Poles in a way. So they only mobilize on the 3rd of April, which only gives them 3 days before the Axis invade them from 3.5 sides. So there's no hope. I mean, Yugoslavia is not a super developed country. It's very mountainous in many regions. So you're not, it takes time for villagers to get to their unit depot, to be equipped, to march on foot to the nearest train station, to then go where they're supposed to go. You're not going to manage that in 3 days, right? This is not Western Germany in 1914 with a train every 38 seconds or whatever on a dense rail network. It's just not going to work out. They're even short basic equipment like boots, for example. So it's not a huge surprise that they lose. The speed with which the Axis is able to defeat Yugoslavia, given its mountainous terrain, for example, one might think, given some of the numbers that the Yugoslavs had. But nonetheless, that's how it works out. There was some discussion about making the South a bastion to hold out. They do spread their forces, but they were thinking and talking to the Greeks and Brits, basically saying, well, the biggest town in the South is Niš, and that could have been a focal point for some resistance, protecting those access points to Greece. The Greeks wanted Yugoslav help for an offensive against the Italians, because they're thinking, well, if the Germans are invading Yugoslavia and us, Greece, we should get rid of the Italians as soon as possible in Albania. That's a doable goal, which makes sense until the Yugoslavs are not able to resist the Germans from all the other sides. So there's a very limited attempt. A few Yugoslav units start advancing against the Italians, I think on the 8th of April, and they don't really get very far, and they're in danger of being cut off from the rear anyway because the Germans and Italians are streaming through Yugoslav lines in the rest of the country. So, in the Hungarian area, they are limited. I will say they just want the regions of Yugoslavia that were a part of the Kingdom of Hungary before, with the exception of Croatia, which is a special case. So they take a region called the Banat, and there's not a lot of fighting there. But the case of Croatia is quite significant because April 10th, the so-called independent state of Croatia, which is basically a fascist state that's, you could kind of call it a puppet state, even though it has independent in the name, right? Names are not don't always reveal everything about countries. Democratic North Korea, socialist this and that, not always socialist, and so on. So you have an independent in name Croatian state that's declared in the middle of this campaign. It is German aligned. It has a fascist style leadership, the Ustaše, as they call themselves. And that contributes to this collapse because there is a debate that, maybe because of the so-called nationalities problem in Yugoslavia, that's why the army collapses, because Slovenes weren't willing to die for a Serb-dominated country, or Croatians all wanted independence. I can't claim to be an expert on all the literature about that, but from what I've taken away from it, there is some discussion about how much that was a role. How active was a potential fifth column, supposedly mostly of Croatians? Unfortunately, a lot of the historical arguments divide on ethnic lines, which makes it a bit more difficult, especially for an outsider, to figure out. But long story short, it seems that many Croatian soldiers and units were fighting as much as they could, as much as the rest of the army did, until this declaration of an independent or a separate Croatia on April 10th. And then you really have a problem with the army, and that contributes to the speed of the collapse, let's say. The king flees, by the way. This 17-year-old King Peter, he manages to get out. And then you have already some preparations for partisan warfare. So it's not necessarily the same as, say, France or Poland, where it takes a while to start thinking about partisan warfare and for it to get going. The Yugoslavs are already thinking, because of their experience in the First World War, where they did have some, usually called chetniks, or komitaches, some irregular partisan forces. So they're already kind of thinking, well, that could be a part of our resistance as time goes by. And after the April 17th, 18th armistice, there is a guerrilla force loyal to the Yugoslav monarchy. Now, there will be other guerrilla forces that become more prominent later, mostly communist-oriented. But at the beginning, there's this royalist Chetniks who are led by an officer who stays behind. Mihailovic is his family name. And that's kind of the first kernel of what will become arguably the most successful partisan movement, or movements, because there are different ones, in the Second World War. And that's already something that the Yugoslavs are thinking about before the campaign even begins. I am sure they did not expect to have to implement it as quickly as they did, but it's a thing, and it becomes an immediate component of the post-April 1941 situation in the Balkans. And of course, I would be remiss not to mention that the Croatians then play quite a significant role in these eventual partisan conflicts, and they set up a concentration camp at Jasenovac and kill several 100,000 people, etc. That goes beyond this episode, but I think if we're starting to talk about this state of Croatia, it's worth a little foreshadow that they end up doing a lot of awful things. So that was my little, the French word comes to mind, renchérissement. So a little like pleasant addition to our campaign summary that we had for Yugoslavia. So, any other thoughts on the Yugoslav campaign? 2 very interesting weeks, 2 very tragic weeks for the majority of the Yugoslav population.
Well, I think we can leave the pure military side behind, because as we've now explained it, you just again reinforce. I mean, the military side of this particular campaign is actually, it's very short. It's over in a flash. The real struggle begins afterwards. We're not going to be talking, as you said, in detail about the partisan warfare here, but this is, of course, the defining image that most people have when they talk about the Balkans in the Second World War. And to many German soldiers, this is the one area they didn't want to get posted to after this campaign is over, because of the brutality of the partisan, anti-partisan fighting, warfare, whatever you want to call it. So, but that, as we now said a number of times, that's probably for a different episode when we talk about partisans in more detail. I mean, you talked about it, so you've got this cake here now. The government has gone, the king has disappeared, peace is signed. You've got this cake, and everyone wants a peace, don't they? And you already mentioned the big one. So you've got Croatia, this puppet regime. You've got large parts of Slovenia around Ljubljana, Laibach, that are now occupied, annexed by Italy. So basically going back again to this idea that Italy had after the First World War. Maribor, the northern part, is occupied by, or annexed, you might say, by Germany. But also the other nations are getting the little piece of the cake. You already talked about Hungary, so they're getting their piece all the way down to a place called Novi Sad. You then have the German control, and that's proper German military occupation of Serbia. That's the military commander in Serbia that is there. So that's the niche area all the way up to Belgrade. This is where, again, in the light of all this partisan, anti-partisan warfare later on, the Germans really, what's the right word? Misbehave, perhaps, to put it mildly.
That's an understatement,
some really interesting studies on the German troops. And again, in this light of anti-partisan warfare. But again, that's for a different episode. And of course, you also have more territory annexed by Italy in the south of Yugoslavia. So that's around Albania. And of course, Bulgaria gets its prize as well, around the area of Skopje. So this is quite a large area that Bulgaria gets, even though they didn't really actively participate in the fight, but they made it possible for the Axis troops, i.e. the Germans here, to station their troops, then march up, as we said earlier, towards Belgrade. We had a member of the family who was there, part of that particular German invasion force. It was always interesting when he talked about his war experience afterwards. He always said the happiest time was when he was in Bulgaria before the invasion of Yugoslavia, because he always said, well, everything worked in Bulgaria. And to use his particular quote, the Bulgarian is the Prussian of the Balkans, whatever that means. But in every conversation, he dropped that particular line. There we are. He also had some other lines, but that's the one about Bulgaria.
Unfortunately, they have the same record of victories and losses in the first half of the 20th century as the Prussians do, so I don't know how well that holds, but I digress yet again. Apologies to any Bulgarian listeners.
Well, he also, well, here's a little rabbit hole, family rabbit hole. He was also the man who would insist on driving his car down very small village roads with speed of 80 to 90 kilometers an hour. So what is that, 50 to 60 miles? And when he was challenged and said, do you think it's a good idea? Because you're getting a bit old, you can't really see anymore, you can't hear, and all you do is accelerate. Do you think that's a good idea? Shouldn't you basically just hand in your driving license and not drive anymore? The standard answer was, I managed to drive my lorry to the gates of Moscow in 1941, so I can cope with this. Thank you very much. I mean, what do you say to that? There we are. That's normally ended that particular conversation. That's a complete rabbit hole, but there we got nothing to do with Yugoslavia. But yeah, it was always quite funny. I think that's probably pretty much it, isn't it? So Yugoslavia doesn't exist as a country anymore. It's gone now in 1941. Territories annexed by other countries. You've got one area which now comes under German occupation. You've got a puppet regime, and it stops to exist as a country. We then move into the second phase. We've now said a number of times we're not going to deal with this. That's the next phase, the partisan warfare, which really gets quite nasty. But that's for another podcast. And of course, this is only the one side of this, the whole Balkan story, because there is still the other campaign that needs to be taken into consideration, needs to be analyzed. And that, of course, is now the campaign against Greece, which particularly for Western listeners, and you particularly might say, well, the Germans and, of course, the Brits and New Zealanders culminates, if that's the right word, with the fight for Crete. But I am looking at the clock. I think we might have to do all that in a different episode. Is that right, Jesse? What do you think?
Absolutely. I think Greece, we want to give the Greek campaign on the mainland, so not only Crete, but we want to give it its due. It's very interesting and it's quite significant. So we will wrap up then this episode on Yugoslavia. I will say that from the Axis point of view, Yugoslavia stops existing. But from the Allied British point of view, it's occupied. There's a government in exile that Britain hopes to restore after the war. Just so we're clear on that. So that was today's episode about the German campaign in Yugoslavia in spring 1941. If you enjoyed it, and if you've enjoyed out there, listeners and viewers, any other content that we've produced, you might want to think about supporting the podcast, because that will allow us to do more of this and to explore more of these maybe slightly less in the English-speaking world mainstream topics, but that are important to understanding the war as a whole. You can do that. You can become a supporter by going to bothsidesofthewire.com and signing up there. You can even get access to exclusive content that is not on publicly accessible platforms. You can trial that access for a month for free by using the code Deep Dark Woods. So that's it for today. That's it for Yugoslavia in 1941. And we will see you in the next episode in Greece. You've been listening to World War II Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening. Aha.
Boom. There we are.
A mere 50 minutes on a 12-day campaign.
Oh.
I kill me.